Hello, welcome to another episode of Economic Divide with me, Kavit Tafwai. In this week's show, we will be looking at the United Arab Emirates, and in particular, around the story that claims the Persian Gulf nation has become a hub for smuggling gold, with many questioning the ethics of just how and where the gold is obtained from. Well, in recent years, the United Arab Emirates and Dubai in particular has established itself as one of the world's leading hubs for gold trading, with imports of the precious metal increasing by 58%, valuing more than $27 billion US. Just looking at the figures of the nation's official gold reserves, we can see that in Q1 of 2015, the increase started, but it was Q3 of 2019, right here, that it really saw a sharp increase. So where does the ethical situation lie? Much of the gold is being mined in conflict regions where so-called blood gold is being exploited. Shipments of gold transit via Dubai to places like Switzerland via ghost companies, one of which is named Kaladi. Leaked FinCEN files flagged Kaladi as being involved in $9.3 billion US of suspicious activity. But investigations were dropped so as not to upset the relationship between the US and the UAE. Well, don't forget, we always like to hear from our viewers here on Economic Divide. So if you have a story that you'd like to share with us, get in touch with us by writing to us. We promise to get back to all of you. Let's now take a look at our first report by looking at the blood gold scam in more detail.
There's no precious metal in the world that has the same appeal, attraction and history as gold, weighing in with an atomic weight of 196.967 and appearing 79th on the periodic table of elements. The valuable commodity has seen global gold rushes, civilizations develop, global trade, and of course consumer demand soar over the beauty of the element. But not all that shines is gold, in particular when it comes to the gold market emanating from the United Arab Emirates. As much like the famous coined term of blood diamonds, it seems that the trading markets of Dubai and Abu Dhabi are home to blood gold. With much of the imported gold heading to the Persian Gulf state arriving from mines in Africa and South America, it seems that the ethical values surrounding its production and mining are being wiped from the slate in the UAE, allowing Western investors from Switzerland and Britain to purchase gold in vast quantities without being worried about how it was obtained and where it came from. Dubai in particular is famous for having the world's cheapest end-user gold prices per gram, hence seeing its souks and bazaars thriving with excited shoppers keen to get their hands on the latest designs. But on a wider scale, the sentiment is very much the same. Whereas around 80% of precious metals in the world are traded through the London Metals Exchange, it seems that the values placed on the buying and selling of precious metals is being ignored by the authorities, who turn a blind eye to Dubai's conflict gold. With commission in sales mounting in the millions of dollars, why then would authorities crack down on the malpractice being seen in Dubai? So serious are the sums that even following a leak in the recent FinCEN files, the US chose not to take any legal cases further against the UAE in order to preserve the special relationship between the two, maintaining the US foothold in the Persian Gulf with allies such as the UAE and Bahrain. It seems then that so illustrious is the gleam from gold that it's blinding too many people, whilst at the same time allowing itself to be tarnished from the blood and conflict surrounding the land that it was mined from, proving that exploitation is part and parcel of the gold market, and Western nations simply just don't care.
I'm pleased to say that joining me in the studio today is Mahan Abedin and special guest, Deputy Director of the Persian Gulf Studies Center, Masoud Rezai. Well, many thanks for both of you to joining us here at Economic Divide. Well, let me first turn to you, Mr. Rezai, and ask you a little bit about the Persian Gulf Studies Center and what research you undertake.
با عرض سلام. مرکز متحد خلیج فارس در سال 1386 جهت حفظ و حراست از نام خلیج فارس شروع به فعالیت.
Hello to you. The Persian Gulf Studies Center began in 1386 to preserve the name Persian Gulf, which is our focus. But due to the events that unfolded in the past decade in the region, like the wars, we began our work focusing on the strategic and geopolitics of this important region. Currently, we have coverage of regional issues and also preserving the name of the Persian Gulf and issue related to it.
Okay. Let me first ask you about the story that we're covering, where the UAE appears to be a hub of commerce, priding itself on being a modern trading post, as they claim, in the Persian Gulf, which it is in essence. However, it seems that there's a dark side to the nation, the core topic of our program today, with allegations that it's purchasing large quantities of unethically obtained gold, calling it black gold or blood gold. Do you think that the UAE risks losing its reputation by dealing in such activities? And also, if you can tell us about the European partners and clients of the UAE, which in turn are turning a blind eye to this act.
ببینید امارات متحده عربی در طی سالیان اخیر ابایی نداشته از اینکه نشون بده
The UAE in recent years has not held back in showing itself as a regional hub for precious metals and stones. And this is not something that the UAE's Western partners and allies are not aware of. In fact, reports from UK Treasury Office and the Foreign Ministry, which was released this past December, showed that the UAE, to a rather large extent, has had activities in the areas where the government has not had a good performance. Ones that are actually failed states containing active revolutionary groups, like in Africa, like Central Africa, or Eastern Africa, countries like Sudan, Southern Sudan, or the Congo. The UAE exports gold from these countries. And in this report, it was stated that these regions were controlled by dangerous cartels. And it is, for this reason, a lot of cash and funds go in and out of the UAE. There is no oversight on this. The report also revealed that more than 95% of the exported gold to the UAE comes from Africa. Now, aside from the UK, the gold that is imported to the UAE also goes to the places like Switzerland.
Very interesting. Okay, Mohan, to you now. The UAE expanding just beyond gold, actually, when it comes to trading, exports, and commerce. Do you think that the UAE is involved in these forms of smuggling, in particular in the financial sector, with Dubai also being a leading banking hub by many respects?
Well, what we know is that the United Arab Emirates is a center for all sorts of illicit and illegal activities. And one thing we know, for instance, is that organized crime groups, particularly those originating from the Indian subcontinent, have a stranglehold there. And by all credible accounts, a lot of their activities is known to the UAE authorities. Now, for reasons unknown, they turn a blind eye to that activity. Presumably, one has to speculate is because the ruling elites in the UAE benefit from that organized crime. As long as these groups don't bring violence into the Emirates, they're basically allowed to run their activities. And of course, their activities are region-wide. And in some instances, for instance, the issue you just talked about with the gold, etc., they have global implications. So in answer to your question, the UAE is a big center for illicit activities. And we also know it's a big hub for money laundering. And here, I mean, the gentleman, our colleague just mentioned the UK, but in terms of a research capacity, but the UK is actually also involved in a practical sense. London is also a hub for global money laundering.
Okay, many thanks to you both. Now, let's take a look at the Persian Gulf state of Qatar and how the blockade that was led by the Saudi regime is still actually being resisted by the UAE.
Three and a half years ago, the Saudi regime spearheaded a scheme against the Persian Gulf state of Qatar, accusing Doha of supporting and funding terrorism. However, Qatar was quick to rebuff all allegations, but it was not enough for what was about to happen next. The resulting blockade on Qatar saw all land and air routes into the peninsula state blocked by the Saudi regime and some of its allies in the region, including the United Arab Emirates. Qatari's national airline Qatar Airways alone saw a $1.9 billion loss of earnings due to rerouting routes, and some passengers sought alternative routes to avoid the longer airtime. The action saw Qatar lose much of its food imports from Saudi Arabia, a quantity that in fact saw over 80% of its imports dry up overnight. Yet in stepped the Islamic Republic of Iran and Turkey, who both assisted Qatar in both food supplies and airspace, keeping Doha going over 3 years. Just this month, however, the blockade was finally lifted following a regional conference in which the Saudis invited the Qataris back to the negotiating table. Yet for the United Arab Emirates, it seemed all too much, with Abu Dhabi still pointing the finger at Doha and accusing them of funding terrorist groups.
We have legitimate national security concerns over Qatar's conduct. They are serious concern, and we would like to see them addressed by Qatar before we restore the privileges of friendship.
Although the UAE have finally agreed in following the path of Saudi Arabia and company, the suspicion still lies in situ, raising the question as to just what kind of unity Persian Gulf Arab states are able to achieve, if at all.
Joining us back in the studio is Mahan Abedin and Masoud Rezai. Mr. Rezai, big news coming out of the Persian Gulf surrounding the lifting of the blockade on Qatar that made splash on the news. Yet, it seems like the UAE appears to be kind of resisting this lifting of the blockade, accusing the Qataris of supporting terrorist groups, for example. Do you think that this is a way that it's setting out an example of multilateralism, so to speak, in the Persian Gulf? Or is this the UAE throwing its toys out of the pram?
ببینید بین عربستان سعودی و امارات که در واقع جزء محاصره کنندگان قطر هستند.
The UAE and Saudi Arabia are the main countries that placed the blockade on Qatar. They cooperated on many fronts to execute this blockade. They also have had many differences when it came to Qatar. One of those would be the war on Yemen, and then Qatar's case. According to the latest, the blockade on Qatar has now been lifted. The UAE's Prime Minister announced that more contact needs to be made with Qatar for confidence-building measures. On Qatar's relationship with the UAE after the 2017 blockade, and in order for Qatar to evade and escape this blockade, Qatar went after strategic areas in the region, especially investing in maritime ports. What we can also refer to are competitive regional alignments that have been formed, like the Qatar-Turkey Union on one hand, and Emirates, Saudi, Israeli bloc, part of the new Silk Road project, which has strategic ports in its route. Aside from this, one of the 13 preconditions that were set for Qatar was to discontinue or dislodge the Turkish military base in Doha. Of course, Qatar did not accept that, and this is one of the main reasons why Emirates is not keen on the Qatari blockade to have been lifted.
Okay, Mahan, reconciliation, the word of the day, it seems, in the West Asian region. Do you think that the normalization of ties between the UAE and the Israeli regime is a sign of more things to come in the Persian Gulf based on what some people are saying? We know that Bahrain is also in the mix. And what is it going to mean for the political economy of the region, do you think?
Well, I think normalization as far as the Persian Gulf area is concerned has probably run its writ. I don't imagine it expanding anytime soon. Certainly, Qatar is not going to join that coalition, no way. I mean, as our colleague just pointed out, Qatar is very much in the Turkish orbit. It's ideologically is to some extent under the grip of the Muslim Brotherhood, so normalizing with Israel is out of the question. But in terms of the political economy of the region, this whole reconciliation thing, well, it does change things a bit because the blockade is going to be lifted. So Qatar is once again, at least partially, is going to be reintegrated with the local economy consisting of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. But I have no doubt that this reconciliation was mostly contrived. It came from under the pressure of the United States. We know for a fact that the Emiratis were not happy with the terms of the reconciliation. I mean, they're not necessarily opposed to reconciliation in principle, but they're not on board in terms of how it's happened and so quickly. The Saudis, of course, are. And I don't envisage it will last very long, because the differences between Qatar and the UAE and Saudi are quite profound. And of course, on top of all that, you have economic incentives. Qatar is going to be a competitor to these countries, especially taking into account that Qatar has gone deeper in terms of attracting intellectual capital. They've tried to transform themselves into a global hub for culture, movies.
And sports with the...
exactly. I mean, just look at the Qatar Foundation. It's involved in all manner of intellectual endeavors around the world. So huge divides between these states. So yeah, the blockade has been lifted, but it's going to be a very rocky ride.
Sure, we'll find out sooner than later, hopefully. Okay, thanks to Mahan and Mr. Razai there. We'll be seeing them again after our final report later in the show. Now, we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere. The conversation continues right after these short messages. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavit Hathaway. Time now to look at a deeper picture in our in-depth section. The year 2020 saw the United Arab Emirates become the world's third largest buyer of gold, with the Turkish central bank leading the way on 41 tons of gold, followed by Russia at 19 tons, with the UAE scooping up 5.9 tons of the precious metal. The UAE made its entire 5.9 tons purchase in the month of January. Now, of the other Persian Gulf states, only the Saudis and the Qataris bought gold, with 100 kilograms going to Saudi Arabia and 1.6 tons going to Doha, which all was incidentally sold the same year. No other Persian Gulf states purchased any of the valuable metal. So why is the UAE buying so much gold? Well, according to a Reuters article, billions of dollars of gold is being smuggled out of Africa through the UAE, with customs data showing the UAE imported $15.1 billion worth from Africa in the year 2016, and that is a figure that has risen rapidly over the last 4 years. One of the main reasons for this is a tax avoidance scheme, with no taxes being paid to the states that produce them, allowing Western final users of the product being able to buy black market gold from a third party, in this case the UAE, without the notion of it being directly tied to child labor, conflict or exploitation, hence essentially allowing a gold laundering operation to take place, with the UAE to be the facilitator. Well, let's now take a look at our final report of the show, which assesses the exploitation of labor in the UAE.
According to the International Labour Organization, there are some 146,000 female domestic workers living and working in the United Arab Emirates, many of them from the Far East, such as the Philippines, as well as Africa. As the cities of Dubai and Abu Dhabi soar into the skies with the world's most lavish and luxury buildings, the hidden workforce behind the glitz and glamour are the ones who are forgotten and exploited. So twisted and unbalanced is the law that all migrant workers in the UAE are tied to their employers to remain in the country under a system known as the kafala rule. For domestic workers in particular, this means that they have less rights than other migrant workers and see the staff living in squalid conditions, being paid less than minimum wages, and in many cases see them being abused by their employers in a variety of ways, from physical, emotional, and unfortunately sexual abuse. Such is the extent of the problem, which is in essence nothing more than modern-day slavery. 30 US congressmen called on Mike Pompeo to raise the issue, coinciding with Human Rights Day in December. However, much like the issue with blood gold, the US have failed to bring the matter to notice, instead preferring to keep its strategically placed partner in the Persian Gulf happy and not spoiling the status quo, which so suits the Americans and of course the elite royals of the United Arab Emirates.
Back again is Masoud Rezai, Deputy Director of the Persian Gulf Studies Center, and our very own Mahan Abedin. Thanks again to both of you for being with us. Okay, Mr. Rezai, final question here. A clear abuse of workers in the UAE has been cited and recorded. Many laborers coming from the subcontinent, they are being exploited there to further their Emirati economy, obviously, and in particular the infrastructure there, construction in particular. Do you think that places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi are profiting at the expense of others and breaching human rights in the process?
The issue of human rights is subservient to the geopolitics of the region. In other words, in the western part of Asia and the Persian Gulf, we need to look at which country falls into what geopolitical aspect of the region. If it falls into the geopolitics of the West and the US in particular, then human rights issues are not even part of the equation. You can see that human rights for countries in the region has no connection to human rights in the US. No pressure is exerted on these regional countries. No boundaries have been set forth for them. I can tell you frankly that these regional countries can form terrorist groups, buy and sell their oil, give them money and weapons. Any type of transaction or money laundering can be done because they are US's allies and they can get away with it. This also serves a reason for the US to have a presence in the West Asia region. The West will not have the regional countries' human rights issues get in the way of their other dealing and won't let this affect their relationship. We obviously know that many countries in this region do not have nor follow human rights policies compatible with the West, and we can say they are worlds apart.
Okay, final question to you, Mohan. There's a huge economic divide, I don't know if you agree, between the elite ruling families in the UAE and across the Persian Gulf in some states, of Arab states that is. Do you think that this status quo will change anytime in the near future with resistance mounting against the ruling families? We have seen instances of that.
Well, people have talked about this for a long time, and one has to admit these ruling families have proved to be more resilient than people imagine. But again, the fissures are real, the divisions are very real, and what's been happening in the past decade has been very interesting, because up to that point, much of the dissent was economic in terms of the elites having access to everything in places like the UAE and Bahrain. Of course, there was a revolution in Bahrain in 2011 that was suppressed. Now, Bahrain, mind you, is a little bit different to the UAE because there's a sectarian dimension there. It's the ruling Sunni family is a small minority, whereas the majority is Shia. But if you look at the UAE, a country that doesn't have that problem, in the past 10 years, they've had to deal with something they've never dealt before, and that's political opposition coming from their own people. And take into account that the majority of the population in the UAE are expats. The actual indigenous people are a minority. And how does the UAE deal with political dissent? It employs the most draconian measures: citizen deprivation, throwing people out, freezing their life, basically, their bank accounts and everything. So it brings out the hammer to squash it. And the question now is, how sustainable is it? And if you look at Saudi Arabia, its problems are even bigger because they have huge political dissent. And the Saudi people, who had been quiet for a very long time, they're now also rising up and making big demands, from women wanting to drive, to civic rights, cultural rights. So yes, these ruling families have proven to be resilient up to now, but don't count on them surviving completely unscathed in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. We appreciate your input, Mohan Abedin. And of course, our special guest, Deputy Director of the Persian Gulf Studies Center, Masoud Rezai. Many thanks for your input. All right, let's now take a look at our news section of the show, 1,000 Words. It has been painted as the oasis of the Persian Gulf, with an ultra-modern infrastructure, a tourist paradise, a transit hub, and a center for international business. But it seems that the golden glow surrounding the United Arab Emirates is fast becoming tarnished. With the revelation that the Emirate is being used as a gold laundering base, nations like the United Kingdom, like Switzerland, they're getting their hands on blood gold, whilst being able to distance themselves from the atrocious way in which the gold is exploited, essentially seeing Bern and London use Dubai and Abu Dhabi as their dirty laundry basket. That's about all the time we have for this episode. I'd like to once again thank our guest Masoud Azai, Deputy Director of the Persian Gulf Study Center, and Mahan Abedin for being on the show. And on behalf of myself and the entire team here on Economic Divide, I'm Kaveh Taghi, looking forward to seeing you next time.